Okay, I'm going to show you something to look out for when you're buying uh, an underquilt or a sleeping bag or anything like that that's made with synthetic insulation. If you're buying something on a budget, one thing that I'm going to show you something to look out for that could affect the how warm the quilt actually is. This is a quilt I just made, and as you can see, it's just sewn on the edge, sewn all the way around the perimeter of it, but there's no what's called quilting, where you got the stitches that run across, and it's kind of like in squares that you'll see in a lot of quilts. The reason they do that is because same thing like old quilts, like maybe your grandma had or made or whatever, how it has all the fancy stitching in it and everything. The reason that is because of that batting that they use. Over time, it will start tearing and start clumping up in spots. So you'll have spots, if you made it like this, if you just sewed it around the edge, and it'll have spots that don't have any insulation and spots that do have a lot of insulation, because over time, and it doesn't take very long, that batting will start tearing and bunching up. And especially in an underquilt, the way it's designed, you know, it kind of hangs like a U. That batting will tear really quickly if it's not quilted, and it'll all start drifting down to this right along the center, and you'll have no insulation on the sides. The insulation I use for this is ClimaShield Apex, and it's designed to be able to use in big sheets like this for quilts or sleeping bags or jackets, and you don't have to do any quilting. All you have to do is sew it along the perimeter, and I'll show you why that quilting on this synthetic insulation could be bad. So this is the ClimaShield Apex insulation. This is rated at 30 degrees. That's what it's actually semi-trimmed off of this one. And the way insulation works is by providing loft that will trap warm air inside there, and then the more loft, the warmer it is. Like this is a 30-degree underquilt, and my -5 underquilt, the insulation is really thick. So what happens when you quilt them, like you'll see in a lot of Amazon underquilts and stuff, is the stitching. When you put the stitching through there, you're sewing it down flat, and now see how you're compressing that insulation, not only right along where the stitching is, but also see how it tapers down. So already right here, you're already starting to lose insulation, and then even more and more as it goes down to there, and then it comes back up the other side the same way. You've got a couple inches on each side of the stitching that you're not getting the full insulation value of that insulation. And then if you had another row of stitching right here, see out of that piece of insulation, you only got a couple inches of the true value of it. The rest of it is lost because it's all compressed and it's not trapping any air. And you might say, well, you know, my grandma's quilt, it was quilted, that batting in there was quilted, and that was a warm quilt. Well, one thing you got to take into consideration, that the material that they used on those old quilts, that alone would provide some warmth compared to the thin material on underquilts and stuff. And also, you use those quilts in a house that's heated, and you're not outside when it's 30 degrees outside, and you got wind you're dealing with and all that kind of stuff that's robbing your heat. So that quilting could work on those blankets that your grandma made or whatever, but on something you're going to use outside, you need that loft to trap that warm air in there, so the cold temperatures and the wind doesn't rob you of that heat. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're looking for a synthetic underquilt on a budget. If it has that quilting in it, you know, like I said, it's normally what you'll see is a bunch of squares sewn into it. That's because they're using kind of inferior insulation. It's basically just quilt batting, and it has to be stitched like that. and you're losing a lot of your insulation value. The insulation that they're using, the batting, it might be rated for 30 degrees, but by the time they do all that quilting and everything, shoot, you might keep you warm when it's 50 if you're lucky. Now you'll see a lot of down underquilts and sleeping bags that look like they have that, but what they actually do is they put baffles in there, and so you're not actually sewing the material down like you are in the synthetic stuff. And if you're curious about that, just look up on YouTube DIY quilt baffles or something like that, and you'll find, and it'll show you how they make those like 3-inch baffles and stuff on there. So when you see the outside, it looks like it's quilted, but it's not really compressing insulation. If you're curious about that on the down quilts, you can look that up. But that's it. I just wanted to give you a little tip. I know a lot of people are on a budget, and especially first getting into hammocks or even camping in general or whatever, trying to find things on a budget. Just keep in mind, some things it's worth spending a little extra money for, and what the stuff that's going to keep you warm, that's definitely worth spending some extra money on. And those, like I said, those quilts that you might see that are cheap and they're quilted and they say they're rated for 30 degrees, and you get outside and it's 50 degrees and you're cold, that's why, because of that quilting is you're losing all your insulation value.